Hey everyone, and welcome to another Konoha Reviews, where we review games both new and old on all platforms. If you like the content that I make, then please subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you never miss a review when it comes out. Today we talk about Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn, which has exploded in popularity in the past few weeks after many players have started playing it after a very disappointing and late update for World of Warcraft and various famous streamers picking up the game as well. Now back in January, I actually had started to play the free trial and leveled the character up to level 15, but honestly was not that impressed with the game, and so I stopped playing it all the way up until now. The hype that was created with the game and the streamers, and yes, also the disappointment of patch 9.1 with World of Warcraft, made it to where I wanted to give this game another chance and now properly level a character all the way through. And I did just that, and also recorded my long 30+ hour journey, which you can check out if you want on my long play channel. It's an epic journey of my created character Azora, who starts out as a humble archer but ends up saving the realm alongside a colorful bunch of heroes. In the video, I mainly focus on the main story quests, so if you are curious about that, I highly recommend to check out my long play of it, and see if it piques your interest in playing it as well. The video link will be in the description down below. Now for this video, I will only be focusing on the Realm Reborn content, which means level 1 to 50 content. I myself bought the expansions and full game, but all of the content that I will talk about today can be played entirely free, which is a huge plus. You even get to play for free up until level 60, meaning through the first expansion, but I will talk about that expansion in a separate video. The main reason why so many people recommend others to play Final Fantasy XIV is for its great story. This was already the norm before the hype happened earlier this month. I remember hearing various YouTubers at the beginning of this year praising the story of Final Fantasy XIV and stating that it's not only a great story for an MMORPG, but a great story for a game in general. The fact that a story supposedly wasn't just good for an MMO, which, let's face it, often hardly is very good, but was actually great for a game in general, was what made me install it and play it at the beginning of this year, since I love story in games so much. Unfortunately, many said that the really good storytelling occurs in the expansions, and that the vanilla-based game, A Realm Reborn, is by far the weakest portion of the game. Well, I certainly thought so when I played it up to level 15, since the quests were incredibly standard with repetitious fetch quests through and through. But as I said, this time I grinded my teeth and got all the way up to level 50 to see if this vanilla game got any better, or if it is indeed not that strong. So let's take a deeper dive into this popular MMO. Before we talk a bit more about Final Fantasy XIV, I want to take a quick minute to summarize my relationship with Final Fantasy in general, as many people have started playing Final Fantasy XIV in the past couple of weeks without ever touching another Final Fantasy game. My experience with Final Fantasy happened when I was 10 years old, and the first Final Fantasy game I ever played and owned was Final Fantasy IX, which is also my personal favorite Final Fantasy of all time. Before that, I had never played an epic story-driven RPG like that before, and it absolutely blew me away. I loved the setting, adored the characters, and was swept in this epic tale where not everything was about gameplay, but where story and dialogue were just as important. Now in my opinion, it's often the first game in a franchise that becomes our favorite, since it introduces us to the new setting and world and gameplay that we fall in love with. To many, Final Fantasy VII was the first Final Fantasy they ever played, and that's why it has such a legendary status. I knew someone whose first Final Fantasy was Final Fantasy VIII, and lo and behold, that particular Final Fantasy is his favorite. And in high school I had a classmate whose first Final Fantasy was X, and that became his favorite. I've played many other Final Fantasy games afterward, with the lowest number being 6 and the highest being 15. I really also liked Final Fantasy X, with such a great cast of characters, beautiful graphics, and such a nice story with one of the best bittersweet endings in gaming, which then, unfortunately, was absolutely ruined by the appalling sequel Final Fantasy X-2, which in my opinion is probably the worst Final Fantasy maybe in the entire franchise, and yes, probably even worse than Final Fantasy XIII, though I do have to admit that I never bothered to play Final Fantasy XIII 2 or 3. I never played Final Fantasy XI because I thought that it felt very generic with these open empty fields you traversed, and for a game franchise that leans so heavily on style, it felt surprisingly bland to me. But that was ironically also the feeling I got when looking at screenshots or footage of Final Fantasy XIV. The characters were nice looking and some had very Final Fantasy-esque features, but most of the environments lacked any sort of significant style or vibe. It just looked like your generic open grass field or forest. Now I definitely think that the environmental graphics in some zones are still quite weak, but we will talk about that in depth in just a minute. Let's just start at the beginning and talk about the setting and story as you make a new character. So the history of Final Fantasy XIV is an interesting one since the initial launch was an absolute disaster with horrible player feedback and professional critiques. It was one of the worst high-stake MMO launches in history and was known for its lack in sense of direction, stupid level gating mechanics, grindiness, and repetitive nature. Now the creators then fired some of the higher-ups and put some younger talent at the reins, and they did what Blizzard had done before with Cataclysm, but with much better results. In the story of Final Fantasy XIV, they wrote in an event where the giant godlike being Bahamut descended upon the earth and destroyed everything in it. Basically, they reset the game and world to start anew and labeled the game, justifiably so, a Realm Reborn. The heroes, aka the players that were at that moment present in the world, were, according to the lore, then sent 5 years into the future where the world slowly was being rebuilt as allegiances lay in turmoil and lots of chaos was throughout. When you create a new character, it is suggested that you were one of those adventurers who were present during that calamity, and I find it praiseworthy that the story writers put in this event without completely erasing the history before it. Even though the game before the calamity was supposedly so awful, the adventures and experience that people and characters had were all documented and not necessarily forgotten. I find this better than just to look the other way and pretend like everything before the calamity never happened. Side characters like Papalimo and Ida, which played a big role already before the calamity happened, still get their time in the spotlights with this new version. Now at the beginning of the game, you of course get to create your own character, and the types of character you get to choose from are not that unique when looking at other Asian MMORPGs like Terra or Blade and Soul. You have your average humans, the tall and lanky elves, the hulking brutes, the little childlike Lafalels, the cat girls, and through the expansions 3 more races including, which I thought was very cool, the bunny girls from Final Fantasy XII. Again, similarities with other MMO games from Asia can be made since they always have those childlike characters in them, including the little girls in Terra and also in Blade and Soul. With Final Fantasy XIV, I honestly just find them a bit weird, but I've actually grown to appreciate them and even find them cute on occasion when characters like Tataru do their funny animations. But just to be sure here, I don't find them cute in a we should call Chris Hansen kind of way. The cat girls, I thought, were very weeb-like, and it took me so long to really start to like them. When initially looking at them, everything to me screamed weebs or furries, or the streamers with the annoying cat ears on their headphones. For the first 2 characters that I made and leveled up to around 15-ish or 20-ish, I also made a male elf and a female human. But lo and behold, I actually started to really warm up to the cat girls since I loved their animated expressions with details like the twitching of the ears and tails or folding up their hands with startled like a real cat would. And so it was to my uttermost surprise that eventually for the build I went with to complete the game, I actually went with the cat girl. And I absolutely adore her. Even though I criticized the headphones with the cat ears just a minute ago, ironically one of the things I really like about the cat girls in the game is that with helmets and hats that they wear, that the ears actually poke out. Yeah, talk about being a hypocrite, I guess. But anyway, I made my cat girl and named her Azora Ishtimars. A nice touch that you get to name both your first and last name, and that they address you like that accordingly with only using your last name if referring to your military rank. You then get to choose a class, and not depending on your race, but on your class is where you start the game. There are 3 locations you can start, which then meld together once you reach around level 16, and then share the same main story quest from there on out. Back when I created a character in January, I started in New Gridania, which is the Elven Forest area, and the first 15 levels were honestly not that impressive, and most of all, it did not even feel all that much like Final Fantasy, but rather just a generic forest. By now having played in the other zones as well, I can say that Limsa is my favorite, since I have a weakness for pirate settings and the overall bright, clean look of the area is great. Though admittedly, it also does not feel that much like Final Fantasy either, since the city mostly consists of these wooden walkways with white stone roads in between. The area outside is just a generic open grass field, with the most Final Fantasy feeling thing being the background view with the high looming castles and the twirling gigantic crystals larger than mountains. The third area, Ul'dah, feels the most like a Final Fantasy zone, since its vibe is pretty close to that of the city and setting of Final Fantasy XII, with its sprawling market city surrounded by gigantic walls, and the desert area outside is also very beautiful and varied with little towns, camps, and outposts laying across the road. Of these three zones, I still think New Gridania is the weakest of them all. But I have come to like the area too, and the music in New Gridania is so nice and relaxing. It really makes me feel like coming home when I enter to receive another one of my job quests. Since I chose to be an archer, my starting place for this playthrough would be New Gridania once more, and though the environments might not be that strongly attuned to a vibe known from Final Fantasy, you still get enough links with the franchise through certain characters or beasts like the Moogles or Chocobos. And it's mostly also the music that makes it feel like a Final Fantasy game, and I have to say that the music in the game is fantastic. From some of the epic blood-pumping songs you hear when fighting huge bosses, to the more mellow and melodious songs in certain areas and zones, or somehow melancholic or sad piano tunes during cutscenes. Graphically, it impresses the most with its character designs and models, and though some of the environments are very nice, like the beach or jungle areas, it definitely shows its weakness with some of the more empty outdoor zones that feel like just your average snow area or grass fields. The voice acting, on the other hand, is quite bad sometimes. Most notably, the cutscene that shows this is the one where all the city leaders are on top of the rocks during the Battle of Carteneau. Their line delivery is atrocious, and has no sense that they are witnessing a giant battle or on their final desperate hours of need. They simply sound like voice actors reading their lines and without much effort at all. Hopefully, the expansions will have some better voice acting to it, but for Realm Reborn, I can say that the overall voice presentation is less than average. I do like how all the voice casts are pretty unfamiliar talent though, which gives each character their own flavor, and I have grown to love some of the voice cast delivery, including characters like Ida and Alphinaud. But what about the actual story and gameplay when you start? The game starts out pretty humble, with you arriving at the town and signing up at the Adventurers Guild to start helping out people with their problems. The first few quests are very basic, like check out the marketplace, talk to your class trainer, etc. All these quests get presented in cutscenes, which for the most part have no spoken dialogue. The cutscenes definitely get better and more animated the more you play through it, but the entire game and its cinematics in the beginning can feel a bit static, and there's a lot of explanation happening early on. Honestly, I know a few friends of mine who will find this probably a huge turnoff, since you'll be watching dialogue cutscenes for a good 10 minutes or so, and the cutscenes themselves aren't all that spectacular. In that regard, something like the Old Republic does do this better, with literally all the cutscenes having spoken dialogue, and though those cutscenes might be even more static with the same type of animation looping over and over again, the overall watching experience is better. Now I will say that one thing I really liked about the cutscenes and presentation in Final Fantasy XIV in the beginning is that you often see other NPC adventurers walk and run around in the background. So many MMORPGs make it out like you are the only adventurer or hero out there, where clearly you see hundreds of other players running and jumping about. This game already takes that into accord, since there are multiple people signing up to be an adventurer, and they present this already within the cutscenes themselves. It indeed from the very start feels like there are others out there who are trying to become a hero just like yourself. The Ul'dah area especially has a very charming cutscene where after a couple of hours of playing, you return to your quest giver, and she just finished giving the welcoming speech to a new adventurer who signed up with her just like you did a few hours ago. It's very charming, and is a good way to go about the fact that so many others are doing the same thing as you. But soon after you familiarize yourself with the town, you are sent out into the wild to do various quests for individuals, and they are your typical and standard quests you already know. Go and kill 6 squirrels. Go and find a missing loot item in a cave. Go and collect 6 oranges. Kill a certain mob and loot a number of items, etc. I kid you not that when you play in the Limbs of Luminous zone, you also get tasked in the main story quest with collecting cow poo at one point as well. And many of these quest types I just described are actually main story quests and not even side quests, which are also your standard types you've done 100 times over. Very repetitive. Now, even though the types of quests you do are not that interesting, maybe the story is, but unfortunately, that also is not the case early on in the beginning. It's just your standard type where certain military figures need help to get a problem fixed, and you are the person to do it. Overall, there's no big conflict or situation that needs to be solved or dealt with. In Limsa Lominsa, they hint a little bit to a mystery where people get suddenly abducted, but this doesn't play a big part until well 3 hours into the game. And thus for the first 3 hours, your experience with Final Fantasy XIV will unfortunately be painfully standard and not surprising or that engaging at all. Now some might say, well, all MMO games start out small and then raise the stakes as you level up more, but I disagree with that. A game like World of Warcraft has some really great and engaging early content with, for example, the Worgen starting zone, maybe being the best starting leveling experience in any MMO game out there, where you take part in this massive battle on an epic scale to protect the city as it gets attacked by werewolves. The story there is epic, engaging, and immediately sucks you in. There are various awesome twists and turns and legendary characters you meet along the way, all in the course of just a few hours. But even besides that zone, a zone like Westfall, which you could head towards after playing only 2 hours or so, had a great engaging storyline as you put on the role of a detective as you try to solve a murder mystery that eventually leads to a giant revolt of the poor folk against the military commanders of the area. And so, this is to demonstrate that yes, immediate engaging and exciting storytelling is definitely possible early on in the game, and no, it does not have to be of a gigantic epic scale like the Worgen area, since the Westfall zone is fairly humble in its scope despite being such a well-written storyline. Unfortunately for the first 3 hours, the story of Final Fantasy XIV will not impress you, and that is a long time for someone to pull through to get to the good stuff. I realize that 3 hours for an MMO game is nothing but a heartbeat. But 3 hours of gaming for some people can be quite the endeavor, especially if they are not completely sold on the game they are playing either. But after 3+ hours, the story picks up the pace, and each zone's story arc ends with a pretty cool battle that feels like a small war zone. In the cutscenes, you are accompanied by many other friendly NPCs, and it's a bit more spectacular and gets you in the mood for an epic clash with the bad guys. The battles themselves are also awesome as you take out enemies while friendly units fight in small groups all around you. It really feels like it's not all about your character, but you take part in this bigger battle where you and your fellow mates all have a stake in it. Even though the storylines in all 3 regions differ, the final battle in the story arcs is slightly similar in that it is presented as larger epic fight. In each zone, you will meet also certain important characters that will reappear throughout the story. In New Britannia, you will meet Papa Limo and my personal favorite, Ida. In Limsa Lominsa, you will meet Ishtola, and in Ul'dah, you will meet Thancred, though I always refer to him as Dante from Devil May Cry because he just looks a lot like him. After you are done with the initial zone story quest, you get to be sent over to the other big cities and then need to get ready to do 3 dungeon runs, one after the other. Before we talk about that, it's important to note that in the cutscenes following your victory, the other NPCs and characters often acknowledge your deeds and victories and are very thankful for what you did. When you talk to the merchants or ticket masters, they are often surprised or humbled to be face to face with the hero of the city, and it really felt nice to get that recognition, whereas with something like World of Warcraft, you are always that nameless character no one knows despite having faced against entire gods. The fact that your action and deeds get appreciated by the others in the cutscenes genuinely feels very good and satisfying, and you often feel part of the group much more so than in World of Warcraft, where you are more the other guy who is tagging along with these famous characters who barely acknowledge you. The writing is also sometimes pretty fun, and it doesn't always take itself too serious, with even plenty of pop culture references to Star Wars, Star Trek, Metal Gear Solid, or Apocalypse Now. Now regarding the story itself, I do have to say it's all a bit basic, and though it definitely has more story going for it than most MMOs, it's still that cliche thing of go to all the corners of the world to collect different colored crystals so you can summon the power to overthrow evil. We have seen this so many times in other games too, and I remember hearing people say that the creators treat the game as a Final Fantasy game first and foremost, and an MMO later. But my guess is that this counts for the expansions, because the story of the vanilla A Realm Reborn is too basic to where it feels like it got a Final Fantasy treatment. Final Fantasy IX has a fantastic story that evolves organically with twists and turns throughout, and even something like Final Fantasy X has a bit more of a basic story, with you going on a pilgrimage to collect summons to save the world. But with Final Fantasy X, the world storytelling and the world building is the real star, and even still has plenty of twists and turns and even some sad moments. Definitely when comparing a Realm Reborn story with the other main Final Fantasy games, it cannot even come close to standing with its numerical brothers and sisters. By now, a new story arc has also been introduced, and the overall bad faction and the enemies in the Realm Reborn have come to light. It is the evil Van Belsar and his minions who serve the Garlean Empire. Van Belsar is a man dressed in giant armor whose design also reminds me of Final Fantasy XII. Though his tone and evilness might be a bit cliché, what I love about these enemies is the love and respect they have for each other. The three who serve directly under Van Belsar want nothing more than to please him and earn their spot next to him. One of the lieutenants, who has giant arm claws, isn't even from the Imperial lands, yet Van Belsar saw his potential and allowed him to train under his rule and earn his spot all the way up to top. The charming Nero yearns for recognition by his master as he hopes that his best designed mechanical weapons will earn him that right. And the female lieutenant simply craves for his love and is willing to die for the man she wants to have on her side. The fact that there is this respect and relation between the bad guys actually brings some depth in them, which we rarely see in games or movies in general. I still wanted to kill them, since they were so evil, but it did make me respect them more when they told me their story of how Van Belsar saved them as he took each and every one of them under his ranks. Now, as mentioned before, when you are done visiting the other cities, the game throws you 3 dungeons you have to clear in order to progress the main story. Now, I love that you are kind of forced to do these dungeons, since in so many other MMO games they are optional, and often the dungeons are a very fun part of the MMO experience. Unfortunately though, the implementation of this so early on with Final Fantasy XIV leaves some things to be desired. As mentioned, you need to do all 3 dungeons one after the other, and it kind of feels like the overall storyline comes to a complete halt since you need to do dungeon after dungeon after dungeon. Usually how it works with dungeons in other games is that you follow a certain story arc all the way through from beginning to end, and at the finale, with its climax, lay the dungeon where you need to defeat a certain bad guy. Though this definitely is also the case later on in Final Fantasy XIV, these 3 dungeons here barely have that. And in my opinion, it would have been better to have about 1 to 2 hours of story content between each dungeon to give some more context or provide other experiences than just the dungeon. Because at this moment, it feels more like the creators had created these 3 dungeons in each zone and were like, oh yeah, you were done with the initial quest? Then go do these dungeons. Do all of them. Why? Doesn't matter, just go and do them. The dungeons themselves are just alright. They're not bad by any means, but they also are a bit forgettable and feel very generic. That's again a bit of an issue with the game's graphic style feeling a bit generic in the first place when it comes to the environments. Something like World of Warcraft, which on a technical level is far inferior, still creates more interesting looking dungeons due to that iconic cartoony style. Even something like Terra has a bit more flavor and style in their environments compared to some of the areas found in the Realm Reborn. Now I will say this about the dungeons, and that is that I do like that you have to already do some various interactions with the environment to proceed. The first dungeon, for example, has you read a memo to solve a certain randomized puzzle, and it's often necessary to look for keys to open locked doors. In the third dungeon, you are often required to collect a gunpowdery substance to blow your way through blockades, and a very fun boss fight gets introduced here too, where you need to have a certain enemy blow himself up near the boss so that you can damage it. But all in all, these 3 dungeons are pretty forgettable, quite maze-like, and honestly won't turn any heads. There are still a few things worth mentioning though regarding the dungeons, and first and foremost, it's the player commendation system. This is a small system that to me had a huge effect. At the end of each dungeon run, you can give another player a commendation for playing nice or well, and if you earn enough commendations, you get certain rewards. This stimulates playing nice and friendly with others, and is something I would like to see in other MMO games as well. People often compare it to other MMORPGs, where the fanbase is overall pretty toxic, and though I have had my share of bad experiences with players in World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy XIV also definitely has its players that just want to rush through a dungeon as fast as they can. I had no real rude players, but did run into multiple people who complained over and over again about the cutscenes in the dungeons. Which brings me to the next point I want to discuss, and those are the cutscenes in the dungeons themselves. At the end of each dungeon, the final boss gets introduced with a small cutscene, and each cutscene usually is 15 to 20 seconds. Not long at all, and a pretty cool way to introduce them. But then the third dungeon, and other future dungeons will have this too, has a longer cutscene that lasts about 2.5 to 3 minutes before the battle starts. Now let me first state that I love this. It gives extra context, background, and story to what is going on and what kind of situation you will be in with this coming fight. This particular cutscene has you confront an evil magic user who shows as much interest in the crystals as you do, and you share a conversation before he transforms a creature into a giant monster. So the fact that this is being shown is something that I love, but at the same time, it gave me absolute anxiety, because I wasn't sure if the other players skipped the cutscene and were already waiting for 3 minutes. Now I can tell you that the first time I did this dungeon, they did not, and headed straight into the battle. During the actual cutscene, I got the message that the battle had started and that I had 15 seconds to join the battlefield before it would be sealed off. But I had never seen the cutscene before, and I wanted to know what was going on, so I was not about to skip ahead and wanted to sit it out. Now, unsurprisingly, the group went in without me and wiped, since they had a player less, but none seemed mad. Nevertheless, it was annoying for me to know that the battle was already raging on for 2 minutes while I'm watching a cutscene, and these types of players just simply annoy me. If they think that 2 or 3 minutes is a long time, I feel sorry for their girlfriends, if they have any. I generally really dislike the types of players who just want to finish the dungeons as quickly as possible and get annoyed when they have to wait a few minutes longer by a certain pool of enemies, or in this case, a cutscene. 3 minutes really isn't that long, guys. Take the time, if you don't want to witness the cutscene, or have already seen it, to maybe grab a snack or a drink or maybe a fast toilet break. 3 minutes really isn't a big deal. And though I have not experienced people actually getting mad about me sitting through the cutscenes, I have had multiple dungeon experiences where multiple players complained about how long the cutscenes were and how they ruined the game overall. I, however, do not agree with this, and welcome the cutscenes as they provide a more interesting setting to what is going on. Also, at the end of the second dungeon, when you return to the quest giver, there's a brilliant cutscene where they make fun of rage quitters. While you partake in the first 2 dungeons, you can see a glimpse of another party of NPC adventurers who will head into the same dungeon as you are. After completing the second one, it is revealed that the party leader has died because the healer did not do a good job. The other party members are furious with her and say it's all her fault. They then want to leave the party and never want to work together ever again. It was such a funny and clever wink to those rage quit douchebags who get angry and annoyed for the dumbest or tiniest reasons during a dungeon or raid run. A really nice and clever touch. After this, you are required to pledge your allegiance to one of the 3 major cities, and you get a very long section where you are just listening to speeches. Now these cutscenes have spoken dialogue, but still feel very static, and can become very repetitive when viewing another one after sitting through 2 already. It's yet again this thing where the creators force you to do the same thing 3 times like they did with a dungeon. In that regard, the base game, A Realm Reborn, definitely has some pacing issues, and it would have yet again been a bit better to have more story content, or at least other gameplay, in between these 3 speeches instead of you hopping from city to city to city to basically watch the same thing over and over again. Pacing wise, it definitely gets better later on, but by now you have played around 7 or 8 hours already, and there have been multiple choke points where I can easily see people giving up since it's just not that engaging or a bit too repetitive. Since it does indeed become better, I do urge everyone who is finding themselves struggling to get through the first hours of the game to hold on, because it will get better. It's a phrase I have heard other Final Fantasy XIV enthusiasts use when describing A Realm Reborn as a whole, and I actually saw this with multiple things when playing Final Fantasy, not with the story alone. As mentioned before, in the beginning, I did not like the forest area of New Gridania that much, but I have grown to love it throughout, and the same for some characters. In the beginning, I disliked the cat girls very much, and now I am playing as a cat girl. Same can be said for other NPCs. You meet the mysterious and a bit arrogant Alphinaud when visiting the 3 speeches, and in the beginning I really thought he was a pompous, arrogant douchebag. but by now, I really like the character, and I'm excited when he and I team up again for a quest. The game grows on you in my opinion, and where other games immediately have you in their grip from the beginning, this soothes you in like a bath, with initially the water being a little bit too hot, but that gets more comfortable the longer you spend in it. Now even so, I do still think that the fact that the beginning hours are such a mess definitely cannot be denied, and all I can say is, we know. We know. But please just bear with it a little longer. Within the story by now, you have joined the secret group known as the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, an organization that vows to protect citizens of the realm by fighting the primals. These are the godlike creatures that get summoned by various tribes and threaten to create chaos and devastation. These primals are basically the summons you know from the earlier Final Fantasy games like Ramuh, Ifrit, Leviathan, etc. At the helm of the Scions of the Seventh Dawn stands Minfilia, a character who is by far the most Final Fantasy looking character in the entire game. I'm not kidding in that she came straight out of Final Fantasy X or XII with her looks. Now up until this point, the story has been okay, but nothing to write home about. There had been some lowlights and a few highlights, but up until this point the game still had not impressed me, but I was having fun since the whole hype surrounding the game carried me through it. But then the first storyline you follow after joining the Scions is the Ifrit storyline, and this storyline, in my opinion, is fantastic. You team up with Thancred and need to solve an issue where people go missing in a nearby town and need to find out who's doing this and what is going on. A true whodunit narrative. The story starts out humble and small, with you questioning various local folk or getting insight from the priests at a nearby church. Then soon after, you find that someone has handed out false religious scriptures to people in need and ropes from the church are even missing, hinting at that the culprit pretends to be a priest of his own. Thus, you and Thancred dress up like poor folk as well to trick the one responsible, and this eventually leads to an epic battle among the ruins with the local beast tribe. But even in this battle, there are some awesome twists and turns as well, as it was a trap all along since one of the military men had decided to betray all of you. A very epic and large-scale battle ensues, and in the end, you and your men are captured and brought before an epic boss fight with Ifrit, which requires you to defeat him with 3 other players. It's a great story arc that is a true highlight in A Realm Reborn, and has exactly those ingredients that I, as a lore lover, want. There's immediately a mystery or problem being presented, and you go out and investigate. You have multiple questions in the beginning, and the game slowly gives you answers to them throughout the questline as the stakes are raised and the plot thickens. It then all comes together in an epic climax with a satisfying ending. After this, you are being sent out on more story arcs, where you need to deal with certain primals, though not all of them are as great as the Ifrit one. The other storyline that stands out is the one where women are mysteriously murdered in a gruesome way with their faces being slashed open. It has a bit of a spooky and Halloween vibe, and has a pretty awesome finale in one of the better dungeons similar to that of a haunted mansion. Another storyline that stands out is the Inquisitor story arc. You head into an area where different houses are at each other's throats and blame one another for heresy. An ominous Inquisitor has set in motion various actions that lead the houses to put the blame on a single man, and you have to help him prove his innocence. Eventually, the Inquisitor in question tries his best to thwart your progress by convincing the other people that you and your group are frauds, but in the end, you take him down, and possibly the best dungeon in A Realm Reborn awaits you with a very satisfying dragon boss fight at the end. One storyline, however, that definitely is one of the worst ones and is again a real drag to get through, is the story arc leading up to Titan. You are tasked with making contact with this group of heroes who defeated the Titan in the past, and instead, you then get assignments to prepare a banquet by gathering food and drinks, which of course isn't as easy as it sounds. You need to go from fetch quest to fetch quest to fetch quest, to even doing a dungeon, which, although it being a very pretty dungeon, is just another one to get these mundane things done, to get a certain ingredient. Now even though the game's writing itself acknowledges that these tasks you are doing are tedious, it still is a very boring part of the game. It constantly tells you that they know that what they are letting you do seems uninteresting or boring, and even in the end of the story arc, that kinda is the point. See, the quest givers who give you these mundane tasks are part of that group of heroes, and wanted to only reveal themselves to those willing to help others with small tasks as well. Which is fine and all, but it honestly is a really boring and dull part this far into the game. And I'm sure that there are some who might defend this quest or story arc, but I think those people might be a bit blinded by weeb love or something, because I'm 100% sure that were Blizzard to put this exact storyline in World of Warcraft, that people would find it really awful and dull storytelling and quest design. It honestly just is. And though A Realm Reborn, up until this point, definitely had some highlights with the Ifrit storyline sticking out high above all, it still has its share of boring and dull storylines well 15 hours into the game. Besides the main story quests, you also have your own class quests, which is a cool thing where this unique storyline is written, where you do quests every 5 levels or so that teach you new abilities and give you better gear. Now this is very subjective on the class you choose, so I will not hold this against the game, but the Bard, which is eventually what the Archer becomes, has one of the dullest storylines in this game. The initial Archer questline is pretty cool, with you getting befriended with 2 other students and you have to work together to take down a dangerous poacher who is causing all kinds of havoc in the nearby forest. But then when you change to a Bard, you need to visit this old man and then go and head somewhere else to kill someone, and then he sings about it. You have to do this multiple times, and though they, by the end, still want to add some weight in revealing why he quit being an archer and resorted to just song, it all feels so dull and cliché. In that regard, some of the other storylines like Lancer or Marauder are far better. But as I said, this is subjective to the class you are currently playing as, so I won't hold this boring storyline of the Bard against the overall game, though I will do that with the Titan storyline, since that is mandatory. It should also be mentioned that by now you actually did get a very interesting twist and cutscene in the form of the home base of the Scions of the Seventh Dawn being raided by the enemy. The way this is presented is great. You just finish a quest, like you always do, and get a call to report back to the home base. Everything is just normal as it seems, and you return back only to find that everyone lies dead on the floor. The rooms are in ruins, and there are signs of a big battle. Minfilia and some of the others have been kidnapped, and you get a pretty sad cutscene where one of the cute vegetable fairies gets killed in a pretty brutal fashion. Now I have heard multiple people speak about how Final Fantasy XIV is not afraid to kill off certain characters, and I've even come multiple times to the edge of crying. But I certainly hope that they were not talking about A Realm Reborn when they spoke of this, because this is pretty much the only somewhat sad cutscene in A Realm Reborn, and was nowhere near emotional enough to have me cry. And I will let you know that I cried during the scene in the first half hour of The Last of Us 1. Now finally, when you are at the end game, after 25 plus hours, you get to the final act, which is pretty cool indeed. By this time, you have reconnected with the legendary engineer Cid, of course a recurring theme in the Final Fantasy games, and you are at the doorstep of the Guardian Empire's fortresses at the borders, planning to get an operation going to free your kidnapped friends. Pretty much from the moment you beat Garuda, and are presented with the secret weapons held by the Empire, the stakes get raised significantly higher, and an amazing cutscene is presented, where the Mecha Godzilla-like weapon makes absolute mincemeat out of the 3 godlike primals you beat before. The aptly named Ultima weapon absorbs the primal powers, and your main objective now is to attack the enemy base and destroy the weapon. The game then slows down a bit, with preparations being made to infiltrate the base. But it all feels still pretty epic, since you need to sneak near the base to overhear a conversation with the enemy higher-ups, and in other quests you need to learn how to dress and salute as an enemy soldier in order to infiltrate the base and steal one of their mechanical walkers, which will be used to provide support. Once all preparations are done, you get to the absolute finale of the game, and need to complete 2 large dungeons and a big boss fight, one after the other. Now there is some level gating here, which I thought was unfortunate because it forces you to do some side stuff for a couple of hours, which was a bit dull, but it does give you the chance to partake in some of the optional more difficult dungeons that the game has to offer. Anyway, once you have that final tedious moment out of the way, it's non-stop action all the way to the end. First, you get to fight a boss which, for some reason, has become a meme where everyone says he's so difficult, but in reality, he's laughably easy. This is the first of the boss fights you do with 7 other players, and the dungeons that follow are also made for 8-player parties. The dungeons can be a bit hectic and frantic, mostly also due to so many players just wanting to run and skip ahead. Especially in the final dungeon, which I did twice. Both times in the first 2 areas, the enemies were completely being ignored as people ran past them, and even in chat, people complained about how long this would take since the cutscenes are so long. They requested to just skip the mobs, since it takes so much time because of the cutscenes anyway, and I honestly do not understand these types of players. One even said that he has done this particular dungeon 10 times and never paid attention to the cutscenes or lore at all. In a game where there are so many cutscenes within the dungeons themselves, and yes, the cutscenes in the final raid are plentiful and pretty long, why would you play it over and over and over again without putting effort in paying attention to the story or lore? If it's only dungeon gameplay that you want, there are tons of other MMORPGs out there with far more interesting gameplay dungeons out there. In that regard, I think it is the fact that there are so many cutscenes in these dungeons that make it stand out and different, since I was so engaged with what's going on, but also at the same time annoyed with people complaining about the cutscenes themselves. I understand you wanting to skip a cutscene if you've already done the dungeon a couple of times, but if you are not willing to put any effort in understanding the story at all, I think you are playing the wrong game. I realize that in many MMO games, people don't read the quest text, but the mechanics are also built around that. In something like Black Desert or World of Warcraft, you simply get a window with the quest text written inside, which you can immediately close with the press of a button. But here, you get to sit through a cutscene for most of the quests, even though yes, you can also skip those. Regardless, I think with MMORPGs like the Old Republic or Final Fantasy XIV, it automatically attracts or warrants players to pay more attention to the story since it presents itself so much more to the foreground. As I said, the beginning hours of the game are painfully slow, and I can understand you not being engaged or interested. But how you manage to then stick out all the way through to the final dungeon and still not putting a single effort in trying to follow what is going on is beyond me. The boss mechanics in the dungeons in A Realm Reborn aren't even all that interesting. The dragon boss at the end of the Inquisitor story arc has some cool mechanics, Garuda has some cool mechanics, and a few boss fights in this last dungeon are pretty interesting. But other than that, many other dungeons and bosses in other MMOs are way more interesting. It's truly the story that kept me going, and though it was still pretty cliche, with the bad guys stealing our friends and we have to save them after collecting all the crystals, by now the penultimate feeling of completing the story had me pumped to actually finish this as I grew to love the story, world, and characters. Also, a fun detail I want to mention is that the dungeon before the final one also has you head through a fortress with 7 other players. Yet every cutscene only shows your own character, and I remember when playing and seeing this, how lame it was to only see my character there and none of the other players. It did that same mistake again that so many MMO games do, where it says I'm the one true hero, but in reality, there are so many others like me doing the exact same thing right now. But lo and behold, almost as if the game read my mind, in the final dungeon that you do, all of the other players do actually show up in the cutscenes, which is very cool and really makes you feel again like you are part of a team taking out a legendary bad guy. The cutscenes and movement are pretty static, and I definitely hope that with the expansions, the cutscenes get a bit more lively with the other players' characters, but I cannot deny that I thought it was very cool to see all 8 of us grab our mighty weapons after the bad guy was done finishing his speech. Though, the fact that the summoners have a book as their weapons is incredibly lame and made me laugh multiple times during the cutscene. Anyway, the final dungeon honestly is very cool with a great section where everyone enters in these mechanical walkers and some awesome, though simple, boss fights, with those particular enemies you have wanted to destroy for a very long time. The end dungeon probably will last you around an hour or so, of which at least 15 minutes you'll be watching cutscenes. The last fight against Ultima is actually very cool and engaging, with the beautiful music and a lot of movement required of the players. The absolute final boss is then a bit meh and over a bit too quickly, but the end cutscene then is very satisfying as you escape the facility in an almost Warthog Run-esque sequence on your mechanical walker Maggie. You get reunited with all of your friends, and on the cliffs the 3 leaders of the major cities hold a speech to announce peace has once more returned to the realm as everyone celebrates. You then return to your home base, where such a charming, short sequence takes place, where you walk through the halls as all of your friends clap for you to acknowledge your deeds. It really felt like a sweet and nice ending to such a long journey that took 35 plus hours to beat. Now I guess technically, A Realm Reborn content does not stop there, since each expansion and the base game end with a prologue to what comes next. But after the peace speech, the game actually rolls proper credits, and to me, it really feels like a definitive end for this particular saga. and the next couple of quests and story arcs feel more attuned to the next expansion than a Realm Reborn. It's the same with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where Spider-Man Away From Home was still technically part of the Phase 3 movies, but in my opinion, Phase 3 ended with Endgame. That felt like a proper ending, where Spider-Man did not. And it's the same here. As I write this, I am further into the story. I just created the Crystal Braves, for those wanting to know, and though some of the story arcs like the Mughals or Leviathan have nothing to do with the Heavensward story, there are already important characters represented from that story and more to where I will count that towards the Heavensward expansion rather than a Realm Reborn. Though I'm also not entirely sure up until what point exactly a Realm Reborn finishes and Heavensward becomes the main game experience. For what it's worth, I can say that the Mughal King fight and Leviathan and Ramu had way more interesting boss mechanics than most boss fights in a Realm Reborn, so this promises a lot of good things to come, and the story for only those first few hours is already more interesting and engaging than the entirety of a Realm Reborn. But yeah, we have come to the end of the journey of a Realm Reborn, and the ending left me satisfied, though not everything was as well balanced during this 35-hour journey. When I look back at it, I had a good time overall, but I rarely got the feeling that this game pulled the MMO genre to a new height or offered something so rarely seen in other similar type games. I would say that the story overall is good for an MMO, but very average and basic for a game in general. Even something like the Old Republic has way better stories in its resumes with the different classes compared to a Realm Reborn story. The fact that it's all about collecting crystals and then stopping a bad faction is a story we have seen all the way back during the Super Nintendo or Nintendo 64 days. When it comes to being impressed by the story as a whole or even the MMO gameplay experience, please do not expect to get this with a Realm Reborn. Apparently, according to so many people, that all comes with the expansions, and though I have barely scratched the surface of the first expansion, it already has me engaged more with what is going on than within this entire game. A Realm Reborn is a slightly better experience than your average MMO, but it's definitely not a must-play for a Realm Reborn alone. Over time, I've grown to love the world, the story, and its characters, but it needed quite some time and work, and even if from now on the game will become better, it's still so difficult to recommend a game experience that will be 35 to 40 hours that is simply just okay. It reminded me of my friends recommending me watching the anime One Piece, since it becomes so good, apparently, after 100 episodes. But up until that point, it's just pretty okay. Now I don't know about you, but I did not want to sit through 100 episodes of just okay content, and I feel that many people will not be that much interested in 35 hours of okay-ish MMO game content. I've heard it being said that the creators vowed to treat this as a Final Fantasy game first and foremost, and an MMO thereafter, but for a Realm Reborn, I don't really feel this. There's a lot to like and love with a Realm Reborn, but for every point that there's to love, there's also something that doesn't work as well or that is a bit tedious or dull. In the end, Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn gets a 7.7. As said, it is slightly better than your average MMO game, but doesn't do anything out of the ordinary compared to similar titles like World of Warcraft, Black Desert, Terra, the Old Republic, or The Elder Scrolls Online. Luckily though, according to so many players from this point forward, things are going to only become better and better. I'm sure that the score for the upcoming Heavensward review will be higher than a 7.7, but we will just have to wait and see when that comes. Currently, as I'm writing this, I'm on the point to embark on this epic journey, and I'm already 9 hours into the content past the credits of A Realm Reborn. I cannot wait to see what this game has in store for me, and how the story hopefully will be pulled to another level.